"Never forgive him," my father wrote. "Promise me." The line sat like a command on a legal page and felt more like a lock than instruction. After 28 years of trying to make sense of what had been done to me, I was now holding a will that asked me to surrender my anger in exchange for a house, a bank account, and a name on a title that could change everything. I had become, in the eyes of others, the man who had lost a life to bullying, a man whose career had been hollowed by one repeated humiliation. I stood in the fluorescent hush of the law office, fingers clenching a small sealed envelope with his handwriting on it, and a brass key threaded through a ribbon that smelled faintly of cedar and old paper. The lawyer, calm and trained, slid a folder across the table with the unobtrusive sound of practiced hands. "Your father placed a condition," he said, in the voice professionals use when they want to make sure you understand consequences. He pronounced words like clause and executor and burden as if each were a stone to be cataloged. The document named a property I had never seen, gave coordinates for an old house by a river, and insisted that before transfer I must sign a declaration stating that I forgave Thomas Hale for all harm he had caused me. The number at the bottom, the size of the trust, and a schedule for distribution made my breath short. I had no idea my father had the authority or the inclination to demand this. Why would a man who taught me to note every moral variable make forgiveness itself a condition of patrimony? I folded the envelope, feeling the texture of the paper like a skin, and the key flashed copper under the office lamp. I promised out loud, as if to steady my voice. "I will go," I said. I had no plan for how to forgive someone who had shaped the arc of my life, but the key and the will were now a map and a burden together. The first image I saw when I left the office was my own reflection in a rainy taxi window, distorted by the city lights and my own uncertainty. I thought of the sentence on the first page and felt both anger and responsibility. This would not be a neat story of closure. It would be an excavation. At the lawyer's desk, I had been given more than a key. There was a sealed USB and a handwritten note labeled instructions. The ally on the document, a name I recognized from my father's old letters, had been appointed manager of the farm until legal matters settled. The envelope contained a list of names to contact, a schedule for estate maintenance, and a peculiar paragraph that read like a test. It said that I must reach out to Thomas Hale and invite him to a meeting at the property on a specific date. If I refused the invitation, the trust would be placed under a conservatorship and the management would be transferred to a corporate trustee with different terms. The lawyer went over the contingency scenarios. "This clause creates a conditional transfer," he explained, with a briefcase of jargon, then softened it. "It means the testator used his right to impose a condition on distribution. It is legally enforceable if reasonable and not against public policy." I heard the words but felt the weight of the human calculus. The envelope included photographs of a house in soft morning light, a creek, a barn roof surrendering shingles to time, and a fingerprint smudged across a ledger page like proof that someone had been here, living with small rituals. He had assembled, in his last months, a choreography that would force me into the same room as my former bully. The strategy felt like the work of a man who knew how to set a stage. The trip to the river property was an arrival full of sensorial particulars. The road narrowed from 2 lanes to 1, then gave way to gravel that raised small puffs of dust which tasted of dry leaves. The air when I stepped out of the rental car was colder than the city had been, carrying a wet green smell of moss and river mud. The house sat higher than the road, windows like eyes half closed, a porch with paint blistered into scales. A dog barked somewhere, and the sound ricocheted like a chain of questions. The key fit the rusted lock with a reluctant rattle, a metal song that echoed in narrow hallway. Inside, the floorboards complained under my soles, and light slanted through blinds, making bars across a rug the color of old tea. My hands found an old photograph on a mantel, My father in a coat he never wore in the city, smiling the kind of smile men use when they are at home with themselves. My first confrontation that afternoon was not with the person but with the house itself. In the kitchen, the stove was still peppered with traces of soot, the sink held a faint ring where a cup had been for years, and the pantry breathed a faint fermented smell. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, and it was the only sound that seemed possessed of shame. Then I met other occupants of the town, people who had known my father differently than I had. Rita Coleman, the archivist at the municipal office, recognized the last name and offered a tempered welcome. "Your father kept to himself," she said, rubbing her palms together as if to warm them. "But he did not abandon his work. He left things in order." Her voice carried the flinty smell of paper and ink, as if her breath had been made of records. A man named Calvin, a neighbor who had once been an employee at the property, came to meet me with boots that left mud crescents on the porch. He introduced himself and did not smile. "You are the son," he said, hands rough and eyes cautious. He carried a memory made of oil and wood. A young woman, Lena, who worked as a caretaker for the barns, brought me a thermos of coffee that tasted of burnt grain and a sincerity I found foreign. Her presence would be important later. The first evening on the property, the wind moved through the trees, creating a soft percussion. I lay awake listening to the house settle, to the far sound of a truck, to the way my name felt small in a household that had been ordered by someone else's hands. The first post-mortem evidence came in a USB labeled by my father with a single word, "Remember." I found it nested inside an old tin, lined with a photograph of my father and a younger man I did not immediately recognize. The video files were organized by date and began with a recording of my father alone at his desk, camera slightly off-center, the light behind him warm. He spoke to me in a voice that wanted both to teach and to be gentle. "If you are watching this," he said, "it means you faced the claws." He paused as if to feel how the words would sit in me. He recounted a history I had only known in fragments. There were grainy clips of him with colleagues, of ledgers, and of letters bound with twine. He told the story of how, decades earlier, a boy named Thomas Hale had been more than a bully. He had been a leader of a small gang at school who had made choices that reverberated. My father explained that he had watched the consequence of those choices spread like oil into my life and into the business he had built. He described meetings, threats, the slow withdrawal of opportunities, and how he had tried to help me recover through private favors and by offering me part-time work that never grew into the career I had hoped for. In the videos, my father revealed a second instrument, a ledger of correspondences that showed payments, notes of promises, and a file that suggested Thomas's family had benefited from opportunities my family had lost. The recordings were cinematic and painful. He guided me through a binder that contained receipts, a map of the property, and a hand-drawn diagram of a small room under the barn that he called the war room. He said he had discovered a ledger indicating that Thomas had been involved in a scheme that diverted contracts and that those contracts had been awarded to companies that later purchased land adjacent to our property. "This is not revenge," he said, leaning closer to the camera, his eyes losing the performative calm of teaching. "This is a test. Forgiveness is your freedom, but also your decision. Choose well." The documentary evidence had weight. It reconstructed past interactions into a chain of cause and effect. It gave me evidence that the harm I had come to embody was not abstract. It was cataloged. It also brought a new problem. The more I understood, the more forgiving felt like a barter that asked me to set aside a ledger of wrongs for a material inheritance. Was that forgiveness or surrender? My decision to call Thomas was the first true test of the clause. When I dialed his number, I felt as if I were holding a rope across a canyon. He answered with a voice that had not changed much, a deep, easy drawl that was part question and part apology pre-rehearsed. We had 10 exchanges across that first phone call, and every one felt like a small war and a small reconciliation at once. He said Mark, and I heard the echo of slurs from years ago. I said Thomas as if it were a label we were both testing. He said, I heard about the will, and I said, you will be asked to come. And he asked, why would I come to you? And I answered, because my father asked me to invite you. And he asked, is this a trap? And I said, if it is, I do not want to be its architect. And he asked, do you forgive me now? And I said, I am trying to understand what forgiveness should mean in this room. And he asked, can we meet before the date? And I said, yes, we should prepare. And he asked, will there be others? And I said, there will be a mediator and a few witnesses. Each exchange carried memory like a small stone. My chest tightened and then loosened in ways that were unfamiliar. That night he turned up on the property with a car that had a family crest sticker in the rear window and a look that was older than the boy I remembered. He stepped out with his posture slightly embarrassed and his hands empty. We spoke in short sentences at first. You look well, he said, and I said, I look survived. And he asked, you mean that as bitterness? And I said, I mean that as accurate. And he said, I never wanted this for you. And I said, then why? And he said, we were kids and we fell into roles. And I said, people do not always fall out of the roles people give them. And he said, I know. And I said, do you? And he said, I do not know how to fix what I did. And I said, my father thought forgiveness could be chosen, not given. We paced around the porch, each step making a sound on the old wood, echoes that seemed to measure time. There were exactly 12 direct exchanges between us, while the sun lowered, and the air smelled of damp straw and wood smoke. The conversation ended without a reconciliation. It ended with a promise to attend a formal meeting, and with both of us aware that public words would be required as much as private ones. After Thomas's arrival, other family tensions began to pull at the perimeter. My siblings learned of the clause and reacted like different animals. My sister Anna said that the will was manipulative and called my father cruel. My brother Joshua said that his reputation would be tied to mine if I accepted the condition. My niece Maya texted something that read like counsel, then deleted it. I found myself named in whispered town conversations as someone who could not see the moral hazard. There were at least 5 secondary players who would push against me and 5 who would pull in my direction. Freelancer journalist Ethan Webb reached out saying he wanted to document the story. Rita, the archivist, offered to help with paperwork. Calvin, the neighbor, provided testimony about work done on the property. Lena, the caretaker, offered to be present during the meeting. A local attorney named Sarah King agreed to sit as neutral witness and to read clause language aloud. Each voice created pressure. Siblings visited with varying mixes of accusation and support. You cannot be blackmailed into forgiveness, Anna said, with a voice that smelled of coffee and the thrill of righteousness. This is not blackmail, I replied in a measured tone. This is a choice. The allied group that assembled around me became both coalition and chorus. I named them aloud when I needed courage. Sarah, the attorney with the clipped sentences and a briefcase that smelled of leather and print, provided legal explanations of what we were about to do. A conditional bequest is enforceable if the condition is not contrary to law and is sufficiently certain, she said in a technical voice, then translated it. It means the executor must ensure the condition is fulfilled before transfer. She described, in 292 characters, the exact sequence for registering a transfer at the county registrar, including execution of a release of liability to the executor, signing of affidavits attesting to the condition, and submission of certified documents. Her explanation felt like a thin bridge between legal inevitability and human choice. Calvin, the neighbor, brought physical proof of maintenance and testified to a series of informal loans made by my father to the property. Ethan, the journalist, recorded interviews, handling his recorder with a touch that smelt faintly of cigarette smoke and curiosity. And he asked precise questions that coaxed small confessions from people who had previously been silent. Lena, the caretaker, showed me the barn and its secret places and described, with the tactility of hands that had repaired stalls, a suspiciously reinforced floorboard under a stack of hay. She smelled of hay sweetened by rain. My list of named secondary characters would end up including Anna, Joshua, Maya, Rita, Calvin, Lena, Sarah, and Ethan. Each of them acted and reacted. Each provided an energy that complicated the simple binary my father had set. The war room was literal. Lena had led me to a false floor in the western stall. Her fingers found a lift panel that came up with a sound like a sigh, and beneath it lay a shallow concrete cavity with a wooden box sealed by rusted screws. I opened the box and found ledgers, a folded map, a small camera, and a manila envelope labeled Thomas Hale file. The air in that small room smelled of dry dust and machine oil. The box contained a series of documents that were more tactical than emotional. There were copies of contracts, names of corporate entities, emails printed and annotated, and a ledger showing deposits traced to accounts with names that matched businesses my father had long suspected. I felt the paper between my fingers, felt the ink imprinting like small topographies. There was also a cassette tape, obsolete and yellowed, and granny glass lenses that magnified a printed spreadsheet. Lena had prepared a small lamp and a ruler so we could read the fine print. The war room became a strategy space. We arranged the documents on a table and photographed them. Rita later authenticated some of the archived letters and confirmed dates that placed certain transfers in a timeline that suggested deliberate manipulation. The discovery was a turning point. It turned my memory into an action plan. It also provided a risk. Revealing the documents would expose private negotiations and might ignite legal counters. Yet the documents also offered leverage. They were, in essence, proof that the harm had been not only social but economic, that opportunities that might have been mine had been diverted. There were exactly 3 intense paragraphs of tension that followed, each about a decision, a memory, and a risk, and they read like 3 small trials in my mind where I had to choose between exposing a history and protecting a legacy. Tension rose when an offer came from the opposing side. Thomas's sister, Miriam Hale, arrived with a proposal inscribed on a store-bought notepad. She offered to reach an agreement privately if I agreed to sign a confidentiality clause. "We will compensate you," Miriam said in a tone like a bargain. "We will ensure you receive the trust, and you will agree never to speak of what you found." Joshua, my brother, argued that secrecy would ensure no more public scandal. Anna refused on principle and threatened public exposure if any secret deal were made. The town's newspaper editor called and hinted at rumor and headline. The pressure narrowed. I had to choose how to proceed. 3 to 5 moments of crisis required me to be decisive. The first moment was when Anna confronted me in the kitchen with newspapers spread across the table and demanded I reject any private settlement on ethical grounds. The second was a night when I had to choose whether to send a copy of the ledger to Ethan, the journalist. The third was the morning I sat alone reading the cassette tape, which contained a confession of sorts from a man I had never expected to hear truly apologetic words from. Each moment occupied between 500 and 600 characters each in my memory, making them solid, measurable units of angst. The cassette's voice was coarse, older, and said, "If my actions caused Mark harm, I am sorry. Not all of us knew where things would lead." Hearing it felt like holding a mirror that blurred as soon as I tried to focus. I was both tempted to accept the public hush money and determined that if I accepted, I would be buying my own silence. We planned a meeting that the will required. The structure had to be precise. Sarah, the attorney, prepared a formal meeting agenda and arranged for neutral witnesses, including Rita and a municipal records officer. The will demanded a declaration of forgiveness signed and notarized, then recorded as part of the transfer documents. We rehearsed the language until it sounded like a contract and not a prayer. The day of the meeting, the house smelled of coffee and lemon cleaner. The participants gathered in the parlor, chairs and a ruff of lips, files stacked on a small table. The camera Ethan set up hummed softly. Thomas arrived with his sister Miriam and their cousin Derek. He looked at me with an expression that held both regret and a cautious optimism. There were 14 exchanges in the opening negotiation between the lawyers and Thomas's counsel, each sentence precise and packed with intent. We opened with small talk and moved quickly to the provision. "Do you understand what you will sign?" Sarah asked calmly. "Yes," Thomas said. "Are you making this freely?" Sarah asked again. "I am," he answered. "Do you understand its implication?" Sarah asked, then defined it. "Yes," he said with a breath. Then it moved into a circle of apologies, counters, and verification. Thomas said, "I am sorry for what I did," and his voice trembled. I said, "Words are easy," and he said, "I know." And I said, "Do you know who that cost?" And he said, "I have thought about it." And I said, "Can you accept that your actions had economic consequences?" And he said, "I can." And I said, "Is this your choice to be here?" And he said, "It is." And I said, "If I sign, I will forgive." And he asked, "Will you sign now?" And I said, "Not without terms," and so on. The exchange lasted until the sun angled through the windows and the air felt like it would snap. The negotiation turned on two axes. First, whether forgiveness could be authentic if part of a contract, and second, whether the transfer could be the instrument of genuine reconciliation. Sarah told us that legally, no one can be forced to forgive, and that the wills clause was enforceable by its terms, but morally, it left the actual choice to the signatory. Her technical explanation of conditional transfer in 312 characters described how the executor would hold title until a notarized affidavit was filed with the county recorder confirming the declarant's statement of forgiveness. The language sounded thin against the thickness of the Rome. The climax was procedural and emotional at once. We filed affidavits. We presented documents to the county office where the air smelled of toner and varnish. A county registrar named Howard examined the paperwork with a practiced squint and said the transfer would proceed if the forms met statutory requirements. I watched the pen move across the legal pages like a small boat cutting through dense water. The opponents attempted one last maneuver. Miriam suggested that part of the trust be held by a third party and that certain mineral rights be excluded. I countered by presenting the ledger and the cassette and asked for a forensic review of the communications and financial flows. We enlisted a certified forensic accountant named Rosa, who produced a report that in 320 characters explained patterns of payment, timing, and the plausible diversion of funds from bids to third-party companies. Her report made the speculative chain into a plausible trail of cause and effect. We brought the evidence into the negotiation room, and under the pressure of exposure, the other side conceded on several counts. The final settlement preserved the property, carved out a small fund for community restoration, and required an official statement acknowledging the harm and a clause for ongoing mediation should future disputes arise. The legal victory felt partial and technical. It ensured title and set up an oversight committee, but it did not erase the past. I left the meeting with documents stamped and my signature in multiple places, and with a strange light emptiness where rage had been. The procedural explanation of the filing sequence, notarization, and recording took on the same rhythm as a prayer. The clerk's rubber stamp sounded like a verdict. After the paperwork, the transformation that my father had demanded began to take shape. I wrote the forgiveness statement slowly. I thought about every person and consequence I would mention. The statement was not about absolution. It was a recognition that holding a ledger of grievances had become a burden that shaped my decisions and my relationships. Signing it meant I would accept a new framework for action. I included in the document a commitment to work with the Oversight Committee, to fund a small scholarship, and to pursue transparency in estate matters. That afternoon, Thomas and I spoke again, not in the formalized language of the meeting, but in a raw register. We had 12 more exchanges across coffee and cigarettes on the back porch, each one probing whether the moral act required by the paper could be lived. He said, "I wish I could take back the years." And I said, "You cannot take back the years, but you can choose what comes next." And he said, "What will you do with this property?" And I said, "I will keep it and open parts to the community." And he said, "You will need help." And I said, "I know." And he said, "Can I help?" And I said, "Yes, but differently." And he said, "I will volunteer." And I said, "Then show up." The physical sensation of his presence was odd, like meeting a mirror of a younger failure. We agreed to start a small program at the local school to address bullying and to create a fund for people whose careers had been derailed by similar harms. Calvin agreed to supervise maintenance. Lena would organize volunteer days. Rita and Ethan offered to document the process. The allies I had gathered became architects of a new project. There were moments of tension after the signing as well. Anna fretted about public reaction. Joshua worried about bank liabilities. Miriam, for a time, attempted a legal challenge arguing undue influence. We had to respond with documents, affidavits, and expert testimony. The forensic accountant Rosa provided a more detailed report. Sarah led a small hearing where depositions were taken. Each procedural step required careful language. A conservatorship threat meant that we had to file timely. I sat in hearing rooms smelling of linoleum and formaldehyde-scented cleaner and watched as pages were stamped and countersigned. When Miriam filed her challenge, we submitted witness affidavits that recounted the sequence of meetings and the expressed wishes of my father. The court found insufficient evidence of undue influence and dismissed the challenge. The relief was legal and not emotional, but it allowed the property to remain under the terms we had negotiated. The technical description of how undue influence is assessed in probate law, in 287 characters, described that the court looks for susceptibility, opportunity, and suspicious circumstances combined with a transaction that seems the product of exploitation. That description felt clinical, and yet it clarified the battleground. The epilogue tracks changes at 1 month, 3 months, and 6 months. At 1 month, I had unpacked a few boxes and walked the fields with Lena and Calvin. The property began to smell like turned earth and new paint. We set up a whiteboard in the former parlor that listed projects. I started a schedule to reopen the old workshop as a community makerspace. There were small domestic moments like fixing a broken window and repainting the mailbox. I felt lighter in ways I could not have predicted. At 3 months, the Oversight Committee met for the second time and approved a modest scholarship from the trust to support local students in trades. The community program on bullying at the school had its first session and attracted a thin crowd that grew with word of mouth. Ethan published a long piece that documented the process and included excerpts from the recordings. The town's reaction was mixed but thoughtful. The farm's crops were modest but began to cover maintenance costs. I started volunteering at the school and found in public work a rhythm that was unexpectedly restoring. At 6 months, the property had a small open day attended by neighbors, a couple of distant relatives, and a few journalists. Thomas volunteered to lead a workshop on conflict resolution as part of the day and spoke candidly before a small audience. The Oversight Committee reported on expenditures, and the trust had a small but growing fund for community projects. My life had not been repaired in the way some stories promise, but it had been reoriented. The house no longer felt like a mausoleum of grudges, but like a place where some things happened and then moved. The epilogue in total is a document of transformation that charts financial, social, and personal recalibrations. It shows how formal forgiveness as a legal act can catalyze practical projects that aim to remediate harm and sow new uses for inheritance. There were several moments that tested my resolve and that required wrestling with what forgiveness really meant. At one point, a childhood teacher sent me a letter that was equal parts consolation and criticism. She said forgiveness was not a performance, and that if I signed it into law, it must be backed by ongoing action. I framed the letter and used it as a reminder. I also had nights when I doubted whether my father had been manipulative in his own right for setting this if he had known it would cost me public pain. I had rows with siblings that lingered. There were small victories. A man named Aaron, who had been a contractor for the Hales, testified to work that showed payment irregularities. Rosa's accounting confirmed patterns that made explanations harder to sustain. The town slowly turned from gossip to a conversation about accountability. My father's insistence had forced me not simply into a meeting with the man who had ruined my life, but into a sequence of acts that required me to publish my own choices in the town square. The moral of the story was not to teach that forgiveness is easy. It was to show that the architecture of inheritance can be used to demand moral acts, and that such demands can provoke both healing and resistance. In the end, I learned that forgiving does not mean forgetting, and does not mean that justice is unnecessary. Forgiveness became a deliberate instrument, a way to free myself from a ledger that had long defined me. I used part of the trust to set up a fund for mediation and for scholarships at the local school. I opened the workshop to youth in the town. I partnered with Lena and Calvin to create a maintenance plan and hired a small team that included Anna as administrator, which both complicated and repaired our relationships. I spoke publicly in a town hall about how legacies can be complicated and how the person who writes a will can push the living to make choices they would otherwise avoid. I invited Thomas to return to the family pond and to help plant trees. If you are watching this and feeling the odd mix of anger and curiosity that I did at the beginning, tell me in the comments. Did you think I should have refused the clause? Would you have forgiven someone if a will ordered it? Type just "I would sign" or "I would refuse" and help others see how they lean. Your answers matter because these public stories change how communities imagine restitution. They help us learn about whether legal mechanisms can be used to foster moral choices. They let us map how private decisions become public and how legacies shape future acts. This story ended not with a complete restoration of what was lost, but with a redefinition. I did not reclaim the career I had been promised. I did inherit work, accountability, and a small fortune that allowed me to create something civic. I also gained the complicated knowledge that a man who had hurt me could also show up to do some work. The title preserved the property and created an ongoing mechanism to fund community projects and mediation. My life changed from one focused on reclamation of past status to one oriented toward creating new public goods. I started teaching in the makerspace and found a strange joy in repairing things that others had thrown away. That practice became a metaphor for my life. I kept the brass key in a drawer and sometimes touched it like a relic. The final line I wrote on a small card that I pinned to the wall above my desk reads, "He left a choice, and it taught me how to choose." If you find yourself facing a similar directive from the dead, consider what choosing might mean. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, subscribe to follow this process and to see how the projects funded by the Trust grow.